Madrid, November 1st, 1700, 2:59 in the afternoon. The palace was silent in the particular way that palaces go silent when the thing everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. Servants stood at their posts without moving. Ministers sat in anteroom chairs without speaking. The priests had been coming and going for days, and the smell of incense had worked its way into every corridor and curtain, until the entire building smelled like a church or a tomb, which, in the end, are not such different things. In the royal bedchamber, Carlos II, King of Spain, King of Naples and Sicily, King of Sardinia, Duke of Milan, Lord of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, sovereign of the most extensive empire the Western world had ever assembled, a man whose titles required a full page to list and whose domains stretched from Madrid to Manila, lay dying at 38 years old. He had been dying, in one way or another, for 38 years. Since before he was born, if you understand. Biology, from the moment his parents conceived him, if you understood what his parents were to each other, and what their parents had been to each other, and what the long interlocking chain of Habsburg marriages had been doing to the family genome for 2 full centuries before he arrived to receive the consequences. He died at 3 in the afternoon, on the 1st day of November, in the year 1700, and with him died a dynasty. Not from war, not from conquest, not from revolution or assassination or the ordinary accidents of fate that end the reigns of kings. The Spanish Habsburg line ended because of a decision made not in any throne room or battle or treaty negotiation, but at the molecular level, deep inside the cells of every ancestor who had chosen to keep the bloodline pure by keeping it relentlessly, catastrophically close. The DNA destroyed the dynasty. It just took 200 years to finish the job. To understand Carlos II, you must first understand what the Habsburgs believed about blood. They believed it was everything. They believed that royal blood was categorically different from common blood, not metaphorically different, not symbolically different, but actually materially, essentially different in the way that gold is different from iron. And because royal blood was so valuable, so irreplaceable, so fundamental to the legitimacy of everything that rested on top of it, it had to be protected, preserved, kept within the family, passed between cousins and uncles and nieces and aunts in an endless, careful circulation that ensured it would never be diluted by the inferior blood of the outside world. They called it pureza de sangre. Purity of blood. It was not a metaphor. It was a policy, and for a time, a surprisingly long time, it appeared to work. The Habsburgs accumulated the most powerful empire in European history through strategic marriage, rather than primarily through war. Charles V, who ruled in the early 16th century, controlled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, and the emerging Spanish colonies in the Americas simultaneously. The family was extraordinary, intelligent, often genuinely talented, possessed of a political instinct sharpened by generations of careful calculation. But underneath the success, something was accumulating that no one could see. Every time a Habsburg married a Habsburg cousin, the gene pool contracted. Alleles that might otherwise have been recessive, hidden, counteracted, neutralized by the different genetic material a non-related spouse would bring, now had nowhere to hide. They began to meet themselves, identical copies of the same genetic variants pairing up in children who had inherited the same DNA from both sides of a family tree that was not, in any meaningful biological sense, a tree at all. It was a circle, the same ancestors appearing again and again, the same DNA cycling endlessly back through the same bloodline, concentrating with each generation like salt water evaporating in a closed basin. Philip I and Joanna of Castile, who had founded the Spanish Habsburg line in the early 16th century, appear repeatedly in Carlos II's family tree, not as distant ancestors filtered through generations of diverse marriages, but cycling back again and again, because the line had folded so completely on itself that almost every branch led back to the same two people. His parents were uncle and niece. His great-grandmother was also his great-great-grandmother. His father, Philip IV, was himself the product of generations of cousin marriages, and had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, 30 years his junior, and his dead wife's sister's daughter. The result of that union was Carlos. The scientists who studied Carlos II's genealogy in a landmark 2009 paper calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than the child of a brother and sister would produce, higher than any number that should be biologically possible in a family that had been marrying outside itself at all, which the Habsburgs had, just not outside itself enough, and not often enough, and always circling back. What this number meant in practice was that the genetic lottery had run out of new combinations to draw from. The same damaged tiles kept being drawn from the same depleted bag, and the mosaic they produced was Carlos II. He was born on November 6, 1661, and his survival past infancy was considered a miracle by the court, and a near miss by his body. He could not walk until he was 8 years old. He could not talk until he was 4. His head was large and his jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, that slight prognathism that had been visible in Habsburg portraiture for generations, charming in its mild form on the faces of Charles V and Philip II, had in Carlos become so severe that his lower jaw protruded far beyond his upper, and his teeth could not meet, and chewing was not a comfort, but a labor, and swallowing was sometimes not possible at all, and the child, who would one day inherit the greatest empire in the world, was fed softened food like an infant for much of his childhood, because his own face would not cooperate with the ordinary requirements of eating. He drooled. He could not help it. The tongue was too large for the mouth, a consequence of the same genetic cascade that had reshaped his jaw, and no amount of royal dignity could entirely suppress the physical reality of a body that had been dealt impossible cards. He was mocked in whispers by the very courtiers who bowed lowest in his presence. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because the court preferred the explanation of witchcraft or demonic curse to the more uncomfortable truth, which was that his condition was not supernatural in origin but dynastic, not imposed from outside but bred from within, the direct consequence of 200 years of decisions made by his own ancestors in the sincere belief that they were protecting something precious. They were protecting it to death. Here is what the histories tend to omit in their focus on the grotesque and the political. Carlos II was, by the accounts of those who knew him without the agenda of ridicule, a gentleman, a genuinely kind one. He was not stupid. His intelligence was uneven, compromised by the neurological effects of his condition, but there were areas in which he was perceptive and areas in which he surprised people who had arrived expecting to be disappointed. He loved animals. He was tender with children. He had a quality that some of his contemporaries, even those who privately pitied or despised him, identified as dignity, not the performed dignity of royal protocol, but something quieter and more personal, the dignity of a person who understood exactly what he was and what he was not, and had found a way to live in that understanding without collapse. He could not have been unaware of the way he was perceived. Intelligence was not required to read the room in a court that underestimated you, to understand what the careful averting of eyes meant, to feel the particular quality of the silences that fell when you entered a conversation. He was the king. Everyone bowed, and yet he prayed constantly. The Habsburg courts were saturated in Catholicism, and Carlos had absorbed it completely, not cynically, not as political performance, but with the fervor of a man who genuinely needed to believe that there was a framework in which his existence made sense, that God had a reason for the body he had been given, that the suffering was not random, that the meaning was somewhere, even if he could not see it from where he stood. He was not entirely wrong to look for meaning. His existence did mean something, just not what he intended. When Carlos was 17, the court began in earnest the project of finding him a wife. This was not a simple task. The ideal Habsburg solution, another Habsburg cousin, was complicated by the increasingly obvious fact that another Habsburg cousin was precisely the last thing his genome needed. The doctors of the court, who understood nothing of genetics, but understood quite a lot about observation, had noted quietly among themselves that the children of the close Habsburg marriages were not thriving. That infant mortality in the royal nurseries was running at a rate that would have horrified even the families of common people, for whom infant death was already a routine grief. That something in the blood of these children was not right, though no vocabulary yet existed to describe what that something was. The marriage negotiations ranged more widely than they had in previous generations, at least in theory. In practice, the field was still constrained by religion, by politics, by the vast complexity of European alliances in the late 17th century, and in the end, Carlos married Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, niece of Louis XIV, young, healthy, brought in from genuinely different genetic stock in the hope, though no one framed it in those terms, that different blood might produce what the same blood had failed to. Marie-Louise was 18 when she arrived in Spain. She wept on the journey, according to those who traveled with her, with the helpless grief of a young woman leaving everything she had known for a country and a husband she had never seen and a court that would never entirely feel like home. She had not chosen this. She had been given to it in the way that royal daughters were given to things, and her feelings about the giving were not consulted. What she found when she arrived was not what she had feared. Carlos was gentle with her, genuinely, consistently gentle, in a way that the court noted with some surprise, because gentleness was not a quality the court had particularly associated with Spanish Habsburg kings. He was not handsome. Nothing about his physical appearance had prepared her for the reality of the Habsburg jaw and the oversized tongue and the difficulty he sometimes had making himself understood. But he was kind and he was trying, and Marie-Louise, who had arrived braced for cruelty, found instead a husband who was doing his best with the considerable disadvantages his birth had handed him. They could not have children. The failure was total, and apparently without remedy. The court tried everything: pilgrimages, prayers, relics of saints pressed against Marie-Louise's abdomen, the advice of physicians whose understanding of reproductive medicine would not have impressed a moderately informed person today. Nothing. The years accumulated without an heir, and the empire that needed one grew more anxious with every year, and Carlos could do nothing about it except continue being gentle and continue praying and continue being the king his body allowed him to be, which was less than what the empire required, but more perhaps than the empire deserved. From a man it had made this way. Marie-Louise died in 1689. She was 26. The cause was appendicitis, or possibly a gastric obstruction, or possibly something that the medicine of the time could neither identify nor treat. She died in pain, in a country that had never been hers, having given 10 years of her life to a marriage that had asked everything of her and returned her nothing she had hoped for at 18. Carlos mourned her in a way that surprised the court again, publicly and privately, with a grief that was not performed for diplomatic audiences, but was simply real. The grief of a man who had loved his wife and been loved by her, who had found in that marriage the one place where his body and his face and his inability to produce an heir were not the primary facts of the room, where he was simply Carlos, and she was simply Marie-Louise, and they had made something between them that was theirs. He kept her portrait beside him until his own death, 11 years later. The court gave him no time for grief. An empire without an heir was a crisis, and a crisis required action, and action meant a second wife. And within months of Marie-Louise's death, the negotiations had produced Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess, robust, from a family whose fertility was practically legendary. Her mother had produced 17 children, brought to Spain with the specific hope that she would produce the one thing Marie-Louise had not. She did not. The years of the second marriage were harder than the years of the first, though in different ways. Maria Anna was not unkind to Carlos, but she was not Marie-Louise. She was political in a way that Marie-Louise had not been, alert to the court factions that surrounded the increasingly frail king, aware that her own position depended on producing an heir she seemed unable to produce, and the awareness made her sharp in ways that the court felt and resented, and that Carlos, who was by now seriously ill, increasingly debilitated, subject to hallucinations, barely able to eat, experienced as another form of exhaustion on top of all the other exhaustions. His health collapsed in the final years with a completeness that reads, in retrospect, like a body that had been maintaining itself through sheer insistence and finally ran out of insistence to spare. He suffered from edema. His vision deteriorated. He experienced episodes that were described by witnesses as fits or trances or moments of complete mental absence during which the king was simply not present behind his own eyes. He had always been weak. His entire life had been a negotiation with physical weakness. But now the weakness was winning, and the court, which had spent decades performing normalcy around him, could no longer pretend. In 1699, the year before his death, he allowed the palace exorcists to perform rites on him, not because he believed it would work. It is not entirely clear what Carlos believed by that point, but because the court needed a performance of action, a visible attempt to address what was visibly wrong, and an exorcism was the vocabulary available to them. The accounts of what the exorcists reported are disturbing and are worth reading, with the understanding that what they were describing, in the language of demonic possession, was almost certainly the neurological and physical effects of 2 centuries of accumulated inbreeding, finally expressing themselves completely in a single terminal collapse. He was not possessed. He was the end product of a biological process, and the process was finishing its work. But here is the thing about Carlos II, that history in its focus on the grotesque frequently loses. In the last year of his life, racked by illness, barely able to move, surrounded by a court that was already quietly negotiating the succession over his head as though he were already gone, Carlos II did the one thing no one expected from him. He thought clearly. The question of who would inherit Spain after his death was not merely a dynastic question. It was a question that would determine the shape of European power for the next century. There were 2 primary candidates: the Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg, representing the continuation of the family line and supported by England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, and Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, representing a Bourbon succession and supported by France. The Habsburg option was the obvious choice for a Habsburg king. Family loyalty, dynastic continuity, the restoration of the pure bloodline that Carlos, though he embodied its failure, had been raised to revere. But Carlos thought about what a Habsburg succession would mean. He thought about the empire he was leaving, still vast, still the most extensive in the Western world, though fraying at every edge. And he thought about what would happen to it if it were divided, as the Habsburg option would likely require, parceled out among the competing claims of the Austrian branch and the Spanish branch and the various powers that supported each. He thought about Spain as a whole, as a functioning unity, as something that could survive and continue and remain itself, rather than being dismembered by the logic of the inheritance dispute. And he signed his will in favor of Philip of Anjou, a French Bourbon, an outsider, the candidate that his own family, his own ancestral logic, his own 2 centuries of inbreeding designed to preserve, would have told him to reject. He chose the empire over the dynasty. He chose the country over the bloodline. He chose, in the last coherent act of a life that had been shaped entirely by forces beyond his control, to exercise the one form of control available to him, the will, the legal document, the considered decision, in the service of something larger than his own family's survival. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty that descended from him rules Spain to this day. Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, ended his dynasty with his own signature, and in doing so, arguably saved his empire. It was not the choice anyone predicted from El Hechizado. It was the choice of a man who had spent 38 years being underestimated, and who, at the end, turned out to have been paying attention all along. He died on November 1st, 1700, having outlived every expectation anyone had ever had for him by approximately 37 years. The autopsy, performed as was customary on royal bodies, produced findings recorded later by the Spanish physician Pedro Gargantilla that read less like a medical report and more like a catalog of everything a human body can endure before it stops. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were gangrenous, his single testicle was black as coal, his skull contained almost no blood. He had been keeping himself alive by force of will, essentially. For years, for decades, for 38 years from the very beginning. The body that had been assembled from the depleted genetic reserves of the most inbred royal family in European history had been refusing, stubbornly and against all physical logic, to be entirely defeated by what it had been given to work with. That stubbornness is worth pausing on. Not because it makes the Habsburg inbreeding program anything other than what it was, a 2-century catastrophe of willful genetic narrowing that produced, in its terminal expression, a king who could barely eat and could not produce an heir. But because within that catastrophe, there was a person, a man who prayed, a man who kept his first wife's portrait beside him until he died, a man who was gentle with children and kind to animals, and who in the end made a political decision of genuine sophistication that preserved an empire at the cost of his dynasty's continuity. The DNA destroyed the dynasty, that is the accurate headline, and it is true. But the man inside the ruined body was not destroyed. He was diminished, limited, compromised at every level by the consequences of decisions made generations before his birth. He never had the chance to be the king he might have been in a different body, born of different choices. The empire he inherited never got the ruler it needed. The wife he loved died young in a foreign country without the children she had been brought to produce. The second wife suffered differently in the same impossible role. All of that is real, and all of it is the consequence of the same biological catastrophe. And yet, he signed the will. He thought clearly about what Spain needed in the moment when clarity was most required and most unlikely. He chose the country over the bloodline in the final act of a life that the bloodline had ruined. That is not a small thing, to rise above the circumstances of your own biology in the moment that matters most. It is, perhaps, the only kind of heroism available to a man born with a 0.254 inbreeding coefficient in 1661. Not the heroism of the battlefield or the negotiating table or the great political speech, but the quieter heroism of using what remains when everything else has been taken. The Spanish Habsburgs had believed, with complete sincerity, that what they were protecting by keeping the blood pure was something precious. They were not stupid people. Charles V was one of the most capable political operators in European history. Philip II built an empire, Philip III, Philip IV, the long chain of them. They were not fools, most of them, and they were not cynics. They genuinely believed that royal blood was different, that its preservation was a sacred obligation, that diluting it with the blood of outsiders would cost something that could not be recovered. What they did not understand, what no one in the 16th or 17th century could have understood, because the science did not yet exist, was that the thing they were protecting was precisely what they were destroying. That purity, in the biological sense, is not preservation, but accumulation of damage. That diversity is not contamination, but resilience. That the outsider blood they feared was exactly what the genome needed to counteract the recessive errors that were building, generation by generation, in the ever-narrowing pool. They thought they were building a fortress. They were building a prison. The tragedy of Carlos II is not simply that a man suffered. Individual suffering, though it matters, happens everywhere and always. The tragedy is the scale of the misunderstanding. 200 years, 14 generations, the most powerful empire in the Western world, all of it moving with complete conviction in precisely the wrong direction. Every marriage carefully arranged, every alliance thoughtfully constructed, every precaution taken against the exact risk that was not the real risk, while the real risk grew, quietly in the genome, like a debt accumulating interest in the dark. And at the end of all of it, a man who could not chew his food, who drooled, who hallucinated in his final years, who kept a portrait of his dead wife beside him and was gentle with children and chose, in his last coherent act, to think about Spain rather than about Habsburgs. The irony is almost unbearable. The dynasty that had spent 2 centuries trying to preserve pure royal blood produced as its final expression a king whose blood was so purely, so exclusively, so catastrophically royal that it had destroyed itself. The circle had closed completely. There was nowhere left for the genome to go. Carlos II was not the failure of the dynasty. He was its logical conclusion. Every marriage that came before him had been a step toward him. Every careful cousin union a contribution to the coefficient that would end with him. He was what the policy had always been building toward, the final term in an equation that had been running since before Spain existed as a unified country. He just happened to also be a person, a gentle, suffering, unexpectedly clear-eyed person who outlived every expectation, signed a will that saved an empire, kept a portrait beside him for 11 years, and died in a palace that smelled like incense and inevitability on the first day of November in the year 1700. His will was contested. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1714, reshaping Europe, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, redrawing the map of the continent. The Bourbon Philip V kept the Spanish throne, as Carlos had intended. The Habsburg Archduke Charles became Holy Roman Emperor instead, as a compromise no one was entirely satisfied with. The empire Carlos had inherited was diminished by the war that followed his death. The Netherlands were lost. Territories in Italy were transferred. The vast unified domain that had been assembled across 2 centuries was broken into its component parts and redistributed among the powers that had spent 14 years fighting over it. Carlos had signed his will to prevent exactly this. He had failed, partially. The war happened anyway. The dismemberment happened anyway. But Spain remained Spain. The core survived. The country that exists today, with its Bourbon monarchy and its parliament and its constitutional history, is the country Carlos chose when he chose Philip of Anjou over the Habsburg alternative. The man who could barely walk as a child, who drooled through his reign, who was mocked as bewitched and pitied as broken, looked at the chessboard in the final year of his ruined life and made the move that kept the game from ending entirely. There is a portrait of Carlos II, painted by Juan Carreño de Miranda in 1685, when the king was 23. It hangs in the Prado in Madrid. Carreño was the court painter, and court painters of the 17th century were not in the business of unflattering honesty. They were in the business of presenting their subjects in the most dignified light available. And yet even Carreño, working within the conventions of court portraiture, working with the full weight of his obligation to make a king look kingly, could not entirely disguise what he was painting. The jaw is there. The slightly unfocused quality in the eyes is there. The body that does not quite fill the frame with the ease that a young man's body should is there, visible beneath the formal clothing and the careful composition. Carreño did his best. He painted a king, but the genetics showed through the brushwork, insisting on their own presence in a canvas that was trying to tell a different story. And yet there is something else in the portrait that is also undeniably present. a quality in the set of the face, in the positioning of the hands, in something around the eyes that Carreño either invented or observed and chose to preserve. A stillness. Not the empty stillness of a man who is not present, but the occupied stillness of a man who is present and thinking, who is somewhere behind those compromised eyes, doing what he always did, watching, absorbing, enduring, continuing. The portrait does not lie about what he was. It also does not lie about who he was. Both truths occupy the same canvas, as they occupied the same man for 38 years. That is his legacy. Not the grotesque, though the grotesque is real. Not the failure to produce an heir, though the failure is real. Not el hechizado, though the cruelty of that nickname is real. His legacy is the will, the decision, the act of a man who had been given almost nothing by his own genetics and who used what remained, the mind, however compromised, the authority, however hollowed, the pen, however difficult to hold, to do the one thing that might be done. He was the Spanish king whose DNA destroyed a dynasty. He was also the Spanish king who, in the moment his dynasty ended, saved something larger than the dynasty. Both of these things are true. The DNA does not get the last word. It never entirely does. What the Habsburgs could not have known, what no one in that era could have known, was that the science they lacked words for was already legible in the nurseries. It was visible in the infant deaths, in the sickly children, in the slow deterioration from one generation to the next, that their own portrait galleries documented, if anyone had been willing to look at them sequentially and honestly. The evidence was there. The conclusion was available. What was missing was not the data, but the framework, the conceptual vocabulary. To understand what the data was saying, we have that vocabulary now. We can look at the family tree of the Spanish Habsburgs and read it the way you read a cautionary text. Each generation, a sentence building toward a conclusion that in retrospect seems inevitable and at the time seemed unthinkable. We can calculate the inbreeding coefficient. We can name the conditions. We can trace the specific genetic mechanisms by which 2 centuries of cousin marriages express themselves in the body of one man in a palace in Madrid in the year 1700. And knowing all of this, having all of this precision and clarity that the Habsburgs did not have, the question that remains is not a scientific one. It is a human one. It is the question the portrait in the Prado keeps asking, quietly, from the wall where it has hung for 300 years. What do you do with what you have been given, when what you have been given is not enough? Carlos II answered that question on the last day he was capable of answering it. He picked up the pen, he signed the will. He chose Spain over the Habsburgs, the empire over the bloodline, the future over the past. It was not enough to prevent the war. It was not enough to save the dynasty. It was not enough by most measures for a king of his responsibilities and his era. But it was what he had, and he used it. That is the story. Not the inbreeding coefficient, though the coefficient is real. Not el hechizado, though the cruelty is real. Not the drooling and the jaw and the hallucinations and the peppercorn heart, though all of it is real. The story is a man made from the wreckage of 2 centuries of misguided love for bloodline purity, rising above the wreckage in the only moment that was his to rise in. The DNA destroyed the dynasty. The man outlasted the DNA, and that, in the end, is worth remembering.